Hello everybody. It's great to see so many of you here today. Start to a brand new year, and what better way to start with another episode of this webinar. I'm super delighted and totally excited to be kicking off these discussions about the circular economy this time with some great speakers from our colleagues from Chatham House, as well as IMI as well. This idea of working on the circular economy came about around the time when we were discussing about COP and climate change. Remember that? Yeah, it feels like a long time ago, but we had these major discussions around climate change. And we thought, well, there's been a lot of discussion around the circular economy. What does it mean for water? What kinds of implications does it have in this uncertain world that's facing climate change? So for those of you who have joined these episodes, webinar series before, you'll know that this is an hour where we don't have a very formal scientific discussion. Actually, it's a real space to engage and challenge different kind of ideas, assumptions, really thinking about the big questions, the big sort of overarching understanding that we might have, rather than looking very specifically at a particular definition or anything like that. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Naho Miramachi. I work as an associate professor at the Department of Geography at King's College London, and it's been a real joy for me to have these short and sweet 1 hour in my week when I have these episodes where I can really sit down and think about, well, what are these underlying ideologies, or what are these underlying discourses that underpin some of the major trends, some of the major directions that we have in this political economy of water in large river basins in particular. I also have my colleague Alan with me. Alan, you want to say a couple of words?
Yeah, just a couple of words. Thank you for joining, everyone, and Happy New Year. As Naho says, you know, this is one of a series we've convened, and we've tried to keep them informal and encourage people to jump in with their questions. I head up a research activity or strategic program at IMI that includes a research program led by Josiane that is working on circular economy, and it's just growing in importance the whole time in the policy space, in Africa and Asia and the Middle East and in Europe and the Americas. It's hugely important. So I think, you know, let's kick off this new year with a lively debate on this very important topic. And let's also remember that the inspiration behind these meetings, in fact, is our former colleague and mentor, in a sense, Professor Tony Allen. And he liked to think big about things. And I think one of the challenges in circular economy and thinking through water and circular economy is the issue of scale, basin scale, large basins, and how to fit the circular economy thinking into that space. And indeed, in his sense, beyond that space in terms of virtual water and trade in virtual water. So with that, back to you, Naho. I'm looking forward to a really lively conversation.
All right, in order to do that, what we're going to do is we're going to have two speakers to kick off. They are both going to speak for about 7-8 minutes. And then we'll open the floor to all of you. But whilst our speakers are speaking, you're more than welcome to use the chat function to type your questions in. But once the floor is open, please feel free to raise your palm hand on the screen. Valentine will help me track any questions that are coming through. And if you're able to, you're welcome to turn on your camera at that point and ask your questions directly to the speakers and also to the floor. Remember, this is a conversation with all of us in this virtual space. So our speakers really are the ones that are going to ignite the fire to get the discussion going. So we have Melissa McEwen Lynn from Chatham House today, and she's going to start off with a bit of the broader pictures around the circular economy and some of the contested ideas around it, the ways in which she's seen the circular economy being applied into different domains as she's done in her work. And then we're going to go to Josiane Nikiema, coming from Imigana, and she's going to talk about a particular project that they've been doing to give us the ground up perspective. So hopefully by 14 minutes into this webinar, you'll have a good view of this sort of global as well as bottom up perspective, and we'll open it up to the floor. So Melissa, the floor is yours.
Hi, thanks very much, Naho and Alan, for inviting me. It's wonderful to be here with you all. Happy New Year. As you will have seen from the flyer, I'm the Programme Manager of the Environment Society Programme at Chatham House. If you're not familiar with Chatham House, it's an international policy institute. So what we do is research and convening in order to provide policy recommendations in the environment space. And as part of that, I run our circular economy programme. So I am not a water expert, but I really welcome this discussion because it's exposed to me that water isn't talked enough at the higher kind of level discussions about the circular economy. So I'm really glad to be opening that discussion with you all. So I guess to kick off with a very short definition of the circular economy, and I'll keep it very brief because I'm aware most of you already know this. But the main thing is moving away from our linear economic system, so take, make, throw away, to a new concept whereby we keep things in use for as long as possible. The added step there with the circular economy that I'll come back to in a few minutes through my presentation is that what we also want to do is extract value from waste. In addition, we also want to minimize the amount of waste that's being produced in the first place. So that goes back to the design stage and designing it out. Circular economy isn't a new thing. It's kind of a concept that's been coined by a few people, but it was certainly happening in many places around the world before it became a popular buzzword. But in terms of the kind of high level governance and policy discussions, we're now starting to move away from the understanding that the circular economy is just a waste management system. And it's now being applied as a framework to different sectors like food systems, critical raw materials is an area that is really getting looked at the moment, obviously with renewable energy and battery storage, and the role of the circular economy as a whole in mitigating climate change by keeping emissions from the production of goods low is now recognised. But the water sector itself hasn't been systematically included in those high level discussions yet. And I guess before I get to the water side, I should caveat that while we think our position at Chatham House is that the circular economy has great potential to bring a lot of benefits to people and planet, there are also quite a few issues that haven't been resolved yet and shouldn't be glossed over. And a few of those that I hope we'll be able to discuss when we get to the Q&A is the issue of global versus local. So we're obviously in a globalized world whereby things get made often in areas where it's lowest cost, but is that the best for the environment? Then there's the issue of overconsumption in the first place. What I'm seeing in my work is, I think, a noble attempt to apply the circular economy to kind of the current levels of consumption, but we really do need to go beyond that. But it's a problem because it's tied to levels of economic development, which leads me to my next point around social justice and north-south power dynamics. So there's a projection by the ILO, for example, that the circular economy will bring a net increase of jobs by about 7 or 8 million in the next 8 years. But who will that be for? Is that going to be in the same sectors that are perhaps negatively impacted by a potential transition to the circular economy? For example, countries which are currently manufacturing very cheap goods that aren't necessarily being made in the most environmentally friendly way. And the final quite big issue is the issue of metrics and standards, and how we measure if something really is circular. There's lots of organizations working on this at the moment, including the ISO. So as I mentioned, water itself, it's not been systematically included in high-level circular economy discussions, but we've obviously seen important steps. So the whole fact that lots of companies are doing life cycle assessments for their products and water footprinting is a great step forward. That's exposed the fact that sometimes water-rich countries, which might be doing quite well in terms of their water efficiency at home, are importing lots of products that are created or produced in water-poor countries. So you have the classic examples, coffee, for example. 1 cup of coffee takes about 140 litres of water to produce. And so actually over 40% of Europe's water footprint lies outside its border. And if we go down to the UK level, 50% of the UK's footprint is from unsustainable sources. The next thing that we need to consider is also quality, which can be affected by the different actors who are using a water source. So industrial pollution along a watercourse, while each individual plant might be meeting dilution levels that are accepted, it might collectively exceed the acceptable pollution levels when we get downstream, and that gets very complicated if the water source is a transboundary water source, very difficult for governing water quality levels. There are now conventions like the UNEC Water Convention for Transboundary Water Cooperation. And again, good steps forward in terms of water governance, but what we're still missing is that final step of the circular economy that I mentioned in the beginning, which is the recovery and the valorization of waste. So 80% of wastewater globally flows back into ecosystems without being treated. And it's estimated that wastewater itself carries upwards of 50% of waste resources lost. So there's actually a lot of value that can be captured in addition to the environmental benefits of reducing the kind of pollution levels in water. So I guess to wrap up that whirlwind tour of circular economy and how it might intersect with water management, I can definitely see on my side how the circular economy can bring benefits for water efficiency, for water quality and recapture of value. But there's also quite a few issues with the circular economy framework. And I'm sure also a lot of issues with implementation on the ground, which I know Josiane is going to go into detail on using some practical examples from her work. So I'm really looking forward to hearing your presentation, Josiane. Thank you.
Great, thank you so much for that. I think we're just going to go straight to Josiane, so the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Happy New Year to all of you, and very pleased for being here today and for the invitation. I want to continue from what was discussed by Melissa and really dive into the details of the adoption of circular economy approaches. And as was mentioned before, I'll be building my talk on a number of examples that we have seen on the ground. But just before going into that, I want to mention that in 2018, IMI published an important report, which is available online. It's available for free download. I'll put the link in a moment on the chat. And this book actually compiled a number of successful business cases that are implemented from around the world, and mostly learning from what is happening in the developing countries. And we looked at topics really going from recycling of solid waste like municipal solid waste or food waste or agro waste to the recycling of liquid waste. And there we are talking about the wastewater from sewers, the fecal sludge, and even the animal manure. And following that, we started really implementing business models on the ground. This was two reasons. One of them was to use them as cases to showcase the potential of circular economies in countries where they didn't have experience with this approach. And also for us, it was an opportunity to fine-tune the models that were designed at the beginning and published in this book. So the very first thing that I want to highlight, really, when you go to the stakeholders and you want to understand what motivates them to engage into circular economy, you come up with a number of reasons. The very first one usually comes as related to the pressure on natural resources. So for instance, in terms of water availability, you can be constrained in part due to climate change, but it could be just because you're in an urban area where the demand is very high for water. And that can be a reason why there is pressure and there is a demand for this. And then you can go on into a need to diversify resources, enhance natural capital, and many more reasons that are similar. And then there are another group of reasons, like the financial factors that influence also some stakeholders to engage into circular economy. And there you can think about opportunities to recover the nutrients in the wastewater. So farmers are very much interested in that. And in other case, for the public sector, for instance, the opportunity to reduce the cost of waste treatment. Sorry, yes. Beyond that, there are also some social aspects like the opportunity to improve sanitation. The health impacts also are very important. What I want to say, when you look at all these benefits, they are, of course, potential benefits. And in a way, they can become perception also for the stakeholders that are involved. So to some extent, it can be an issue if in the reality, the promised benefits are not up to the expected benefits, maybe because they were unrealistic from the beginning, given the context and the limitations that exist in this system. So let's go now to understand who are the people who are involved in circular economy implementation and who actually is responsible for what. Most of the time, it starts with the public sector, and this can be a government body or it can be a representation like a municipal authority. They usually have a very critical role because they have the ability to enact laws. They normally have the responsibility also to invest for the safety and interests of their constituents. But it's very well known that the public sector faces numerous challenges, and that goes from governance issues, political interference, to lack of accountability. And all these issues really have the potential to negatively influence the adoption of the circular economy business solution on the ground. And I will elaborate on that further, but just very quickly, I want to mention also that these public entities sometimes also face issues with lack of capacity, especially when you're trying to implement these solutions in small communities that are, are not exposed to some realities. Another key stakeholder on the ground that you need to deal with, it's the group of composed by the private sector. They are actually, most of the time in most systems, they are the doers. So they are the ones usually that have the responsibility to implement the solutions. Unfortunately, they are usually perceived to be rich and also to have a strong technical capacity, which is not always true, especially when you're dealing with a small and medium-sized enterprise. And more, there is a promotion of the public-private partnerships approach, through which you have the public and the private sector that enter into an agreement to achieve a certain number of targets and to address a number of issues. So yeah, we have to bear that in mind. And then comes the communities. Usually the communities, they are expected to be the ones benefiting from the initiatives. They are essential for the implementation, and they usually have a strong say in the way that the activity is happening. The implementation also requires a very strong involvement of scientific community, because they need to inform on the suitable and unsuitable solutions. They need to assess the impacts of the interventions. They need to introduce the innovations in the countries. They need also to support the optimizations of the systems, the production systems as a whole. You may also have to deal with NGOs and associations. Usually they have, if you start with associations, they have the mandate to safeguard the interests of their members. And the associations usually will come in when they want to safeguard the environment or health or any kind of social benefits. And the social mandate that these entities usually have, it makes them become a form of a reliable and committed actor when you are dealing with the implementation. But then they usually lack the skills for the marketing of the goods that result from the implementation. So these are important elements. And I want to highlight that all these actors, they are local ones, but we have to keep in mind that they are also affected by a range of external factors. And more importantly, their actions may be guided and limited to some extent by the restrictions that are imposed by these funding bodies. Funding bodies or any form of external entity that can play a role in what is happening on the ground. So if I concentrate on the funding bodies, there could be restrictions in the type of technology that can be adopted, imposed by these bodies. There could be restrictions on the type of product that can be obtained. And this can be done regardless of the internal policies and sometimes even regardless of stakeholder preferences. And this is something that is extremely important. So who has the power? In theory, it's the public sector, but sometimes you see scenarios where you have the private sector also playing a very critical role, and other scenarios where you have the communities also raising their voice to communicate what is very important to them. So it's a very complicated landscape, and we need to make sure that in this context, and I think Melissa also mentioned this when she was talking, that we need to make sure that the benefits are not lost and that those who are really targeted are the ultimate beneficiaries of any investment that is made in this space. So this graph that you see here, this image actually shows the kind of landscape that we had to deal with. This was a typical example that we implemented in Ghana. So the municipality came in there with the access, working on the access, providing the land, for the plant construction and entering into a public-private agreement, public-private partnership agreement with the private sector. And that PPP agreement actually defined the roles and responsibilities of the different actors in that. And then for the land, they had to engage with the community, keeping in mind that the land usually belongs to individuals or to community leaders, and in a way they had also to be involved in the process. And then the private entity, I want to highlight here that in our case in Ghana, it was a waste management company. And then this waste management company came in with some an investment in the working capital. They were interested to invest because they were already a waste management company, and they understood that it was necessary for them to invest into more sustainable practices because they were convinced that the status quo would need to change in the near future. But I want to highlight there that the attractiveness of the private entity usually is very limited. You know, it's if you compare waste management to real estate business, for instance, it's not the same. So the waste management is way more difficult, and the benefits, the revenues at least that you can make as a private entity may be limited compared to what you'll be making if you are investing in another type of sector. So this is also something that affects the attractiveness of the business, you know, of private entities to engage and invest into this kind of things. And then also very quickly, I will mention the issue with sometimes some monopoly that could exist in the country when you have a very large company, private company that, you know, drives the whole chain in a certain path. So this has an impact on how things can be going and how things can be implemented. Yeah, and then many other players. In this case, we had to deal with like the farmers and the private truck operators. Just as a way of concluding, I'm sure we'll be able to take a number of these points during our chat in a moment, but I just very quickly want to highlight that it's a very complex situation and approach and, you know, ground when you want to implement these kind of models on the ground. So we really need to if we want to bring a durable change to the system, and we want to enhance the adoption of the circular economy solutions in a way that is sustainable, then we have to address a number of fundamental issues that exist in the system. And one of them I want to highlight is that we need to cancel the benefits that really emerge from poor practices. So if I take the case of Ghana, the municipalities that have access to treatment facilities, they collect from the truck operators who come to dislodge at their facility, they collect what is called tipping fee, which is a fee that they have to pay normally for the treatment of the waste. The issue is that this money is treated as a revenue for the municipality, and they use that to fund a number of activities that they have in the system, which are not necessarily related to sanitation. So they have very little incentives actually to changing their practices and changing or improving the sanitation on the ground. So this is a very negative benefit system that affects their willingness to invest into, bringing a change into the system. And then other issues like managing the expectations, and we need proper data to be able to inform expectations, that we know exactly what kind of revenue we make in this particular case. What can we really aim at? We need to understand that. We need to understand also how to enhance the capacity in the PPP management and address all the internal governance issues that I mentioned before, working on the attractiveness of the sector, working on the business climate, really to facilitate access to land, certifications, and also securing the permits in a reasonable amount of time, working on addressing the marketing constraints. All of these are important issues. And then the very last point I will make is that we also need to work on the risk management and put in place systems that can really monitor the risks and make sure that the risk management is controlled and that there is accountability in the system. These are some of the elements which I believe are very important when it comes to ensuring that circular economy is adopted and implemented on the ground. So let me stop here. I hope I wasn't too long. Thank you very much. And let's open up for the next discussions.
Thank you so much to Melissa and Josiane. Wow, I've just made a huge bunch of notes, and I have lots of sort of thoughts swirling in my head about who ends up being the winners and losers in such a complex context. And it seems to be very multi-scalar. I mean, we're talking about global north, global south. In some cases, we're talking about the public-private relationships. We're talking about the ways in which the communities perceive the benefits, etc. So a really interesting set of ideas I have in my head right now. But are there any questions? I'm just looking at the chat function. I don't think I've seen any questions being posted yet. So the floor is open. If you would like to ask a question, you're welcome to type it in the chat right now. If your internet connection is good enough, you're welcome to raise your palm symbol and we can start the conversation. Yes.
I have a question for Josiane if you need someone to kick off the discussion.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, great. I can see Lila also has her hand up, so I'll be quick. I was very interested to hear what you said about restrictions from donors on the type of technology that can be used and also the type of product that can be created from these schemes. And I just wondered if you could give a bit more detail or an example of that, where those restrictions actually hamper the kind of effort to make the whole system better for the environment.
Sure, I can elaborate on that. So on the restrictions on the technology, if I take most of the financial, so in the developing countries, most of the treatment facilities are constructed using loans that are secured from international banks and international funding bodies. Most of the time, the approach that these entities use to assess the applications is usually based on cost. So it's a cost minimization approach. So you look at the least expensive model or approach, and the focus at that point in time is not really on the sustainability of the investment, not so much, or not until now. The focus at that point in time is really to make sure that we meet a certain number of standards that are internally accepted. So if you are treating wastewater, for instance, you have maybe the local EPA standards that exist for the treated wastewater quality, and it ends there. So if you propose in a situation like this, a model where you have a recycling, wastewater treatment and recycling activity that is added to it, then definitely your cost will be higher and you won't be competitive compared to other systems that do not include that reuse. So the whole system, because of the funding structure that exists, does not encourage circular economy to be introduced. So in the case of ICA/, we estimated that, for instance, the increase in the cost of treatment is very, very significant. But the good news is when you go for that investment upfront, then you sustain the operation of the treatment facility and you avoid going into situation where you have white elephants. You construct a huge facility, you take a loan for that, and you're not even able to make it operate properly because you have a problem there. So this is one on the technical aspect, and the way those proposals are being evaluated, which discourages innovation and discourages adoption of circular economy solutions. And then the second point I will make on the type of products. So you have some restrictions. If you take the European Union, for instance, they have restrictions on the use of fecal sludge in agriculture. So there is a very important risk, not risk, but limitation there. So they cannot promote these kind of things. And sometimes you'll have some countries more and more who are promoting specific goods, specific crops, because there is an economic interest, for those countries to have access to a certain number of products. And then it means that some of the investments, some of the funds that will be made available will be tied to products and will come with a number of restrictions, which do not necessarily give you the freedom as the beneficiary, the country receiving this, to make the kind of changes and the type of adjustments that you would like to make. So if you want to use it, maybe you go for a fecal sludge treatment plant and produce a compost that you want to use for farming and to grow a certain type of crop. You may not be allowed to do that because you have to take into account the restrictions of that funding body that is loaning you the money to do the investment. So these are just typical examples that I can mention to respond to your question. I hope it addresses your points.
There's clearly an issue with financing.
Really interesting, as you say, Josiane, a lot of power relations that are being exhibited there on what kind of restrictions, what kind of enablers there are when it comes to technology. Really interesting. I see Lila's hand is up. Lila.
Yeah, hi everybody, and Happy New Year. It's lovely to be here in this series. It's almost like being in London, and nice to remember Professor Tony Allen too. So thank you for doing this. Really interesting provocations from both of you, Josiane and Melissa. So just to build on some of these issues, I think the whole circular economy debate has been so pitched around a sort of win-win kind of thing, and also very much driven by economics. So how do we bring in some of the insights from politics, from sociology, anthropology, because I think there's several issues here. So one is around also the socio-cultural acceptability. Are people happy to reuse these products or not? Then there's the politics of scale that Alan mentioned. Where are we, what is our level of scale? Because you're always looking at a value chain, and are you talking about reuse? Where is the reuse happening, and how do you deal with that? And finally, of course, as you've alluded, there's the whole politics around who's benefiting and who's losing, and we don't want to reproduce some of the similar structures that we see anyway. So I think a lot of potential here. And one thing I think neither of you really mentioned very much, even though it was in the title, was around climate uncertainties. And where does all this fit in terms of these compounded disasters and uncertainties that we see?
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I think one of the things that got me really thinking about the circular economy, and as I said, it was sort of gestating during the run-up to COP, and I was thinking, so does the circular economy make us more resilient, or does it actually deepen the existing cleavages that we already have? And so yeah, I'm really interested to sort of delve a little bit more into the aspects of social justice. I think, Melissa, you sort of hinted at this aspect of how do we really get our heads around the issues around justice, the global north-south inequality. And if the circular economy isn't a new concept per se, what does it bring in this era of climate uncertainty? I think these are really big questions that's worth asking and chatting about, in these exactly spaces like this. But I see more hands. Alan, your hand is up.
Yeah, I just wanted to kind of reinforce that. The thing that strikes me is that the circular economy kind of ethos and thinking, the framing, I think, as Melissa described it, is very much driven by a sustainability agenda, right? And it's a bit like the SDGs and some of the other, global policy processes around resources. There's always this, or even around conservation for that matter, there's this sort of difficult tension between equality and sustainability, and a real risk that attention is sort of diverted away from gross inequalities to a sort of a given good, or a sort of an ethos of sustainability as the driving force for development and economic action and activity, and ultimately, unfortunately, in many cases, growth. And so increased consumption of goods and services and resources. So, my question, I suppose, to both Melissa and Josiane, to others, please. So if you're online, please do jump in and pose your questions, raise your hand, speak out. What is it we can do to avoid that sort of overt bias? I mean, it's not a bad bias. Sustainability is incredibly important, as we know, certainly from a climate angle. But we risk sort of glossing over or blanking out that whole enormous debate, poverty and inequalities. So I just wonder, what can we do? What do you think is a good modus operandus to avoid that? So perhaps to Melissa at the more global international scale, and Josiane more at that local scale. You mentioned the politics of local government, for example. Is that an entry point for ensuring that these approaches are taken from a sort of poverty, pro-poor standpoint or action point, as opposed to just this sustainable resource management perspective? Back to you.
Yeah, Josiane, do you want to have some reactions first? Oh, sorry, Melissa, and then we'll go to Josiane.
Okay, happy, to do it that way around. I mean, that covers, those reflections cover a lot of different points. So I'm going to say something that is not entirely a smooth thread or train of thought. But in terms of the global versus local, I think cities have a really important role to play. Like, we often see mayors going quite above and beyond what national governments are mandating, because the pressures that they face, and particularly now with the climate crisis, are often more pronounced. I think that probably applies to the water issue as well. But I also think it's potentially wishful thinking to think that we will go back to local circular economies and be done with the whole global system. I don't think that's going to happen, bar some sort of massive disaster like the movie that just came out. I think that while we're not charging, if we think we're going to continue in this global system, which is based on profits at the end of the day, then if we're not charging for the environmental pollution and damage, then there's no way that these circular solutions are profitable. And I think that's a major issue with financing them, and therefore getting things off the ground at bigger scale. Because, as I mentioned, there are lots of examples of local communities doing things that are circular, which are brilliant. I think the only purpose of having these higher level discussions about the circular economy is not to reinvent the wheel, but just to try and apply that thinking at a bigger scale. And if we don't solve that issue around financing, I don't think it's going to happen. And I think it's just going to go round in circles and be a kind of conceptual buzzword that we throw out here and there, as you said. And I had a final point, which I've forgotten, so I'll add to you, Josiane.
Thank you. This was a very difficult question, and I'm not sure I really have a single answer. But maybe one thing I would say, I see there is someone who also wants to talk, but just very quickly, what I would say is maybe trying as much as possible, if we are concerned, we focus on what is happening at the local level. I think collaboration will be very important, and see how we can build strong collaborations on the ground, and making sure that, especially when it comes to implementation or selection, identification of solutions and implementation of solutions, making sure that all voices are heard, so that the solutions that are adopted are solutions that take into account the different needs of different people. Of course, not everybody will be 100% satisfied, but at least some of their considerations and some of their concerns would have been taken into account into the design of the final solution. So this is something that is very important, leaving no one behind. So this is one of the targets that we have in sanitation for SDG 6, like ending, how do you call it? Ending open defecation and increasing access to sanitation. The motto is leaving no one behind. And I think something like this is also very important on the ground with the implementation of the solutions, making sure that we leave no one behind. Thank you.
Really interesting stuff. I see this, I sense this episode is especially diverse this time round. I'm seeing a lot of new faces, a lot of new names. So if you have any examples from your experiences, from your context, where you've seen circular economy work, the ways in which it's been contested, the kinds of power relations that are there, the implications to this broader thinking about natural resources and how we manage them, how we see the relationships with environment and society, please feel free to share. I'd really love to hear some more perspectives as well. Were there any more?
Can I go ahead?
Oh yes,
I'm Umar. I'm from IIT Delhi. Basically, when I was talking about this circular economy, I think this is a very recently becoming a very popular discourse, especially in government and corporate sector. Given the socio-ecological challenges of this concept, the C could indeed help the transitions to sustainability, just and resilient, which helps us to bring a resilient future. However, the actual, I believe, the definition, either the objectives and the form of implementation of C are still unclear. It's inconsistent and contested, I believe. Different actors and sectors are thus articulating circular discourse which align with their interests and which often do not sufficiently examine the ecological, social, and political implementation of circularity, which is going to be the very difficult. Like the moving from linear economy to the circular economy models has never been, I believe, seen. But if we look over the context of water economy, I can call, there are some of the things like we can use the water and bringing the circular concept, like reusing of wastewater. It's a part of a circular economy where we can see that if we are using a water and then again such a treatment facility should be developed that it should be again treated and then pumped back to the domestic households. Like I can give the example of Canada, where people are doing Canada, Singapore, where people are having the concepts of the circular water economy, like they are using the water and then after using it, they again go to the back to pump stations where it has been again treated. The treatment is at the highest level, and then it is being again pumped to the domestic users, where the fresh water savage has been done. But the government has provided the policy, like they incentivize these concepts, they incentivize the water bills, they incentivize the customers even because they provide, they can use it, they motivate them. But in context of developing countries, it's going to be a very difficult challenge, because if I take the example of our country, looking to providing the basic facilities is going to be the need of a government. But providing this concept in a circular water economy, providing the recycling of water, having a highest quality of treatments, and again there are a lot of cultural and even the religious things which are interrelated with this reusing of water, that makes it difficult to know. But there I can say there are a lot of challenges there's no agreed, I can say, general economics or social theory underlining the concept C. For instance, there's a little clarity regarding entropy of law of thermodynamics is applied to the what we can say is C. Since I can say material is like different in different assumptions, like since materials degrade in quantity or quality each time they are cycled or used, they cannot be circulated indefinitely. So that means we need to justify what could be the circularity level and at what level we can do it. Again, we can say this means that to establish a perfect circular economy where all resources or inputs comes from recovered or renewable materials, a general reduction in material demand and ecological thought out is necessary for building a complete circular economic model. Thank you.
Great, thanks so much, Umar, for that. It's interesting that you also say that there's also a socio-cultural element to this, and I think that goes that's sort of bringing up this issue of how is circular economy being framed. Laila was talking that it's very economic centric at the moment, but what kind of other frames are there? So really interesting, and thank you so much for bringing some of your own experience, some of the things that you've been seeing around this sort of discourse and how certain actors are promoting it. Any other comments? I think Alan, he's trying to type something, or is he trying to speak?
Alan is trying to work his device, but unsuccessful.
Okay.
No, Alan is trying to, I want to ask actually a question about scale, because yeah, it's apparent to me, sort of understanding and knowing quite well the work in Ghana that Josie's doing, and that, you know, you see lots of examples of local circular economy programming. So I guess I want to ask a question to everyone, but also to Laila specifically, because you mentioned it. Is scale a problem here? So, you know, you've got to be realistic in terms of a circular economy framing and thinking. It's easy to apply it more locally. It's extremely hard when you start scaling up at different levels, whether it's a major international basin, the Nile, the Ganges, Brahmaputra, Indus, whatever. You know, it's a big challenge, because, you know, the moment you do that the impact of that framing and that approach has you know, enormous consequences on large populations. So I guess I'm asking, is scale a problem for circular economy? So theoretically we can say things are linked and there's some kind of comparative advantage to wastewater reuse in this part of the world, but not in that part of the world. So it shouldn't be encouraged there, whereas it should be encouraged here. I mean, what do people think about that? You know, where can we go with this issue of scale? Beyond just saying it's important. Laila, any thoughts? Or Melissa or Josiane?
Josiane, you unmuted first.
Yeah, okay, great. I have some thoughts on that. You know, when you look at the benefits of circular economy, there are financial benefits, which are of course very important, and these are some of the reasons why some stakeholders, especially when you deal with private sector entities, come into to play because of those financial benefits. But there are many more benefits. There are environmental benefits, there are social benefits, there are, you know, name them, a number of them. We can't value them in the same way. So when we talk, we say that it is circular economy may be relevant in one location and not in another location. I want to question that a little bit, because what is the criteria that we use to say that it is not relevant in a given location? Probably we are going to concentrate on one of these 5 elements, but still, you know, there could be some benefits that, but maybe those benefits are not the ones that are being valued when we are doing the assessment. So the environmental benefits of sustaining a treatment facility, we will have them all the time. Of course, we can think about, we can ask ourselves if there is another kind of approach that can be considered to address the issue. Maybe yes, maybe no, but at least it brings already some benefits. It's going to create some jobs, maybe not many jobs, maybe not as many as other kind of system, but some benefits will be there. So how do we value some benefits versus the others? How do we, prioritize some benefits instead of others? I think this is a very complicated question. And I think this is where the local context is going to come to play, because locally, I don't think the benefits will be valued in the same way. So priorities may change depending on where you are, depending on, who you are dealing with. If you are talking to the public entity, their priorities might be different from if you are talking to the community, and so on. So I think this question is extremely tricky, and I'm not sure we can easily say that there are benefits or there are not benefits in one place or the other. It's a very complicated issue, and I think I'm not an economist, but I understand there is a way that in that kind of a tool that exists that they use to try and prioritize some preferences, like some of these criteria versus over others, to try and see, okay, like a form of weighting, different preferences, different targets, different goals, to see which one will come with, satisfying the most, the highest number of people. So it's a complicated thing, but I think it's not so easy to say that there are no benefits or there are little benefits. There are always benefits, but then we need to value those benefits, and we need to conclude that those benefits are worth the effort. And this is where sometimes it might change depending on who is making the assessment. What do you think, Alan? I'm going a little bit against what you said.
No, it does. It suggests that we need a really good framework, proper, analytical frame of some kind that we apply to the adoption and uptake of circular economy approaches in different contexts at different scales, in order to be able to think about what are the benefits we should be looking for in those different contexts. There's some sort of formalization of this that may be necessary or would be useful anyway. But good thoughts. Others?
Just to add to that, I think that's a really nice idea and good thinking about formalizing value. And I can think of examples where, conversely, applying a circular economy program has had social benefits, but actually not had many environmental benefits. So where, for example, a country has decided to formalize waste pickers in a certain area and given them a living wage and safe working conditions, health benefits, etc., but restricted the number of buyers that they could sell their recycled products or recovered products to, and also faced the issue of a lack of market for certain products. So essentially this facility was operating, the waste pickers were in a kind of better social position, but the environmental benefits weren't really materializing. In terms of scale, I think it's interesting. I think we're operating on lots of different levels, and I think the goalposts are moving, right? Because if we come back to the climate crisis, I mean, the ice caps at the top of the world are melting, and now more shipping routes are going through there where they wouldn't have done beforehand. So we're having this conversation about reducing consumption, but at the same time, global trade is becoming quicker by sea. And even within my own program at Chatham House, we have a work stream looking at circular economy trade and how we can adapt the global trading system to make it more circular. So kind of trying to bend the current system to fit circularity. So that's not really an answer. That's more issues that I've just thrown into the mix. Oh, Lila just said something quite similar in the chat, looking at multiple scales. Yeah, and I mean, with the climate issue, and particularly water stress affecting agricultural production, that might drastically change the places where things are produced and where they're exported to if they start not being, surplus items for certain countries, and actually the focus needing to turn on providing for domestic demand, for example.
Yeah, I think this there's a really interesting thing about the trade-offs between different scales that hasn't really been sort of systematically understood. And I think there's a lot of these inadvertent sort of impacts that happen once you start doing these initiatives at a particular local scale or at a national scale. There are these knock-on effects on other scales that you only know after you start implementing them. So I think this is another sort of area that might require further scrutiny and not just analytical lenses, but also, you know, political discussions about what kind of future do we want, what kind of political economy do we want to see, what kind of how do we as a society define benefits. So some really interesting questions there. There's a couple more minutes, so if there are any final comments,
I can just add something like, yes, like what the Alan was talking about, the scale, but I can say the challenge and what we can say opportunities associated with the circular economy will vary according to difference in each country's stage of development. I can say stage of development resource either the endowment and the political institutions. Especially in developing countries, capacity and financial constraints, economy and the structural conditions, and even the infrastructure deficit coupled with continued urban expansion will necessarily will tailored policies response that cannot be easily replicated from developed countries' experience. And even if it is to be the inclusive and sustainable, the restructuring of economies in accordance with circular value chain, I can say, will require sufficient investment in innovation and financial assets. And it requires investments in the development of robust government policies to mitigate the health and environmental risks associated with poorly regulated waste management and even manufacturing policies. Again, it comes to the low-income countries will continue to experience rapid rate of urbanizations for decades to come, I believe, and primary resource will be needed to fill the infrastructure gap. Unlikely going with the developed countries, like developing countries have minimal stocks of its used building and materials to use. Demand for consumer goods is also expected to rise. So the experience for developed and emerging countries suggests that new goods and individual ownerships are likely to be preferred over second life goods and asset sharing.
I think Kidist, were you about to add? Thank you very much, Uma. Kidist, I saw you unmuted yourself.
Yeah. Yes.
No, there was someone else I thought was going to add something. No, okay. Back to you then, Naho.
Okay, well then, as I said, we always like to keep this short and sweet, a very concise discussion so that you actually want to come back and think more about these issues and hopefully start to have conversations with colleagues, with your community of thinkers on this topic. I found it really interesting, this session, to really think about how do we understand such a complex landscape of different moving factors of power relationships, of economic drivers, of basic fundamental sort of responsibilities of the state, the ways in which the private sector come into play, the actions and mechanisms communities have in order to stake out their interests in all of this, and then, you know, the overlay of climate uncertainty, the sort of challenges that are already existing in terms of climate inequalities, but also, as Melissa was talking about, what are the potential implications of new economic processes happening as a result of climate change. So a really interesting, dense kind of set of issues and ideas that I think we've covered here. I saw there was a comment in the chat if there are any further episodes being planned. Yes, there are. We're in the process of setting a couple more. So once you've registered, we'll keep your contacts. So when the next brochure, the next webinar comes out, you'll get an email from us letting you know. So please feel free to sign up again and join us for another set of series. Alan, was there any other final comments you want to say before we close?
No, just to thank again the two speakers, Melissa and Josiane, and to thank the participants and to welcome you all to a fantastic 2022 and hopefully a further several meetings such as this now in the coming months. So stay tuned.
Yes, thank you so much. And thanks so much to Melissa and Josiane once again for doing a fantastic job for kicking us off and giving us such great detail and insights. All right, everyone, have a good rest of the day wherever you are, and we'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.